Welcome to Chapter 7, Land Resources and Agriculture. We are going to look briefly at land resources and the many different ways humans use land for everything from farming to human settlements to lumber. And we will spend most of the time, though, talking about agriculture. The bottom line is that human land use affects the environment in many ways, and as you will see, many of those ways, if not most, tend to be negative. I'm going to skip the case study here at the beginning of the chapter, and we will talk about that in class. So when we look at land use, one of the major concepts is called the tragedy of the commons. I will run through what that is and then explain how that relates to land use. So quickly here, the definition of the tragedy of the commons is the tendency of a shared, unregulated public resource to become depleted by people acting in self-interest for short-term gain. So let's break down what that means. Public resource means that resource is open to any individual or any company. It is not owned by one particular party. Shared means that the public shares this resource. So many individuals or companies share a particular resource. And unregulated, we're talking about when government has not placed restrictions on what happens with that particular public resource. And public resources include many things. Here we're talking about land, but also other public resources include things like water and fishing industry, etc. So any land, air, or water can be a public resource that's shared and could be unregulated. And when that happens, the resource tends to become depleted by people acting in their interest for short-term gain. So what does the last part of that sentence mean? So here we have an example of a common area with grass. And on this commons, they are showing 3 animals grazing. Let's say they each belonged to 3 different farmers. Then each of the farmers might think to themselves, well, there's plenty of grass here. I think I will bring 2 animals to graze. So if they each bring 2 animals to graze, then they have 6 animals grazing on that same area of land. And as that happens, these animals, the carrying capacity of that common area may be reached and then exceeded. And if it's exceeded, then the habitat can no longer support the organisms or the population that were brought to it. So we have to look at all of the types of land in particular here that are shared and may be unregulated or have limited regulations, and understand that these can lead to serious environmental impacts. A small subset of this concept is an externality. An externality is a cost or benefit of a good or service that's not included in the purchase price. So an externality, it's an economic term, but it's what happens in these types of common areas. So to give one example, if you purchase a gallon of gasoline, you're not paying directly in that gallon of gas, the price of the gallon of gasoline, for perhaps an oil spill that took place or pollution of the air. Those types of things are not included in the price of the product or the service. So therefore, the public shares that cost, and it's more likely that a negative externality will exist, that something bad will come from that. Okay, so we mentioned carrying capacity earlier. So if you recall, when a population, has lots of resources available to it, particularly food, it will start growing more quickly. And then as the carrying capacity for that population is reached, growth typically slows and you get a change from an exponential curve to an S-shaped curve. Now, we're going to look now at a related concept, maximum sustainable yield. The maximum amount of a renewable resource that can be harvested without compromising the future availability of that resource. And Typically, and in theory, but often very accurately, a population can be harvested up until about the halfway point where it's still growing rapidly. And then if allowed a chance to recover, it will recover. But if we move beyond this halfway point, the population typically crashes. A very well-known example of this is fishing. If we know the quantity of fish that are in a particular location or ecosystem, and we know how many fish we are withdrawing from that ecosystem, then we can make sure that we never go below that fast growth period, that maximum sustainable yield rate, so that the population doesn't crash. So we'll look in just a few minutes at a specific example of when that didn't take place. For now, though, we're going to move beyond these basic underlying definitions and take a brief look at land uses and land management. So land can be classified in various ways. Let me go back one here. If I were to ask you to sit down and think for yourself, if you pictured all of the land in the United States, what percentage of it is used for human settlements? That means cities and towns. What percentage do you think is used for agriculture, either growing crops or grazing? What percentage would you think would be used for forestry, for gathering lumber? Okay, once you have those thoughts in your mind, let's take a look. You can see that urban use of land, residential and transportation, constitutes only 4% of the land use in the United States. We have approximately 50%. So we have grasslands that are used for grazing, croplands where crops are purposely planted, and forests that are used for grazing as well. All of this is used, so roughly 50% is for food. And we've talked before about how the population of the United States has grown. We've talked about how the population of the world has grown. And that's where it becomes important when you look not only at the use of land for residential uses, but that 50% is just is required to feed that human population. And that's just in the United States. You can see that some land is not really usable. That's desert and tundra land. And we have another 25% that goes toward timber production. And last, a small percentage, 11%, for recreational and wildlife. So this is why I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about agriculture, because it does, it's the primary use of land in the United States. Now, you should be aware that some lands are public lands and some are privately held lands. And generally, the public lands are managed in the United States, and they're managed for different uses, including scientific, educational, and recreational. Sometimes they're used to protect certain species, for example, certain ecosystems. They may also be public lands used for mineral resources, that is for mining. And sometimes they're used to protect cultural resources. Just some brief definitions here from the previous slide to explain that rangelands are dry and open grasslands, so they're primarily used for cattle grazing because it's too dry to plant crops. Another important definition is forest. It's areas dominated by trees, as I'm sure you know. One point that I do want to make regarding forest is that the lumber can be harvested sustainably or not sustainably. So one way of obtaining the wood or clearing the wood is called clear cutting. And in clear cutting, all of the trees are just cut down. And can you think of why that would be a problem? Well, when they regrow, they all are regrowing at the same height. So we've talked before about how organisms such as birds might do resource partitioning. Some might live at the top of a tree. Some might live at the bottom of a tree. So here we've eliminated the habitat at first, and then when we regrow, we don't have any variety. It can also lead to erosion. A slightly better, but still not perfect, way of obtaining the lumber is selective cutting, where only those trees that are needed for, let's say, a particular furniture are cut down, and others are left standing. And third is ecologically sustainable forestry, where there is selective, we don't have a graph of that here. Okay, well, there is selective cutting in that they therefore leave a variety of sizes of trees, but it can also be managed in a way where the trees are allowed to regrow before cutting down further. So you don't run into problems as you would for other things where you're actually depleting the resource. If you want to buy ecologically sustainable forestry, you can buy it from a lumber yard. It is labeled as such so you can tell what you're buying. Okay, so last but not least, you see the slide is all in black and white. I just want to mention briefly that mostly, especially in the United States, federal land is regulated. And there are a number of ways that it's regulated. A couple that I want to point out are the second one here, environmental impact statement. So if you have public or private land and a company wants to do something major with it, such as build a wind farm, then the regulations require that an impact statement be written that outlines the scope and purpose of the project and what impact it will have on the environment. And as part of that, also to write up a mitigation plan. So if there are impacts on the environment, then they would need to state how they will mitigate such an impact. So for example, that first wind farm that they were looking at building in Nantucket Sound had an environmental impact statement. I don't recall exactly how long it was, but I'm going to say hundreds of pages. Even the summary was 25 pages, I do recall that. And they look at everything. For example, will it disturb the fish that live on the bottom? Will birds fly into it? Will there be any risk of oil coming to shore? Transmission lines, all of those types of things. And then come up with a plan as to how they would deal with that. So you probably will be hearing about that in the future as we look to other options. Okay, I'm going to end this one here because I think after this, yes, I'm going to talk about residential land use on a next recording.